Welcome to Big Ben's Big Books. Today we're going to be discussing The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And before really getting into the plot, just a word on the historical context in which it was written. This was published right on the heels of World War I. Obviously a very traumatic time for Europe and a lot of questions about how the quote-unquote civilized world could have gotten to this point. And so the book is intimately concerned with that, especially with the ideological landscape of Europe going into the war. And so I think of it as a philosophical novel above all else, in which the plot is actually kind of secondary. But nevertheless, let's go over the plot a little bit. Of course, spoiler alert. Basically, Hans Castorp, a typical bourgeois and German engineer in training, visits his cousin Joachim, who's a military man being treated for tuberculosis at the Berghof sanatorium high up in the Swiss Alps in Davos. He originally intends to stay for 3 weeks, but eventually becomes acclimated and sick himself, and he winds up staying for 7 years. So I think Hans as a character is very interesting in this book because he is, in Mann's words, essentially mediocre. He is, at least on the outside, a very typical representative of his country and his social class. But what he is exceptional in is his ability to listen and to kind of hold multiple ideas at once. He is the ideal person for the very ideologically motivated sort of zealots who he finds around him, chiefly Settembrini and NAFTA. So Settembrini is a Republican humanist. He is Italian. His father was a professor. His grandfather was a political revolutionary, and he is a literary man. He is the personification of the most lofty ideals of the Enlightenment, sees death and suffering as meaningless impediments to life which ought to be conquered through the perfection of human reason. The state, meanwhile, exists to preserve individual freedom, and the individual will attain to the highest state on their own will. Now, NAFTA is absolutely the opposite. He is a reactionary extremist and a communist, a Jesuit and ethnically Jewish, so sort of a lot of contradictions, who says individual freedom to do what, Settembrini? In NAFTA's mind, there's a sharp distinction between the flesh and the spirit. The individual will, being of the flesh, and the flesh being inferior because it's corruptible, must be conquered by the collective will of the spirit as imposed through a program of absolute terror. In short, a dictatorship on earth, whether that resembles that of a Gregory the Great, the temporal authority of the church being imposed to orient the people to the divine will of God as interpreted through that church, or the dictatorship of the proletariat to serve as a transitory stage in the evolution of society to the stateless utopia of communism. In any case, the individual is something to be conquered, and it's something to be compelled to act according to a transcendental collective ideal of the spirit. Now, of course, not everybody is a philosophical windbag in this book. You have Joachim, the cousin of Hans, who is very much inspired by action and a sense of duty. He, above everyone else, wants to get back to the quote-unquote flatlands. He wants to be a military hero, and there's a lot to respect about him in that regard. There's also Pieperkorn, who is a Dutch colonist. He symbolizes a sort of vitalism, or the absolute emphasis on feelings over reason. When he, Settembrini, and NAFTA are all together, notably, he dominates them through his sheer stature and presence, even if he can't form really a coherent thought because he's so drunk all the time. Yet he's ultimately old, sickly, and decaying on the inside, even with that physical dominance. Klavdia, meanwhile, is Hans's major crush. Ooh. Literally, probably hundreds of pages of this book are devoted to Hans crushing on Klavdia. She is a direct stand-in for Russia and the East, who seduces the uptight, repressed bourgeois West, as epitomized by Castorp. She believes it's only through sin and walking in darkness that humanity can become moral, because without sin there can be no grace, as without negation, there can be no appreciation of the positive. Claudia is essentially passive as well. She puts a lot of stock in the sort of experience of life, and rather than trying to make the will manifest on the exterior, sort of embracing interiority and just taking in the mystery, not necessarily trying to systematize and solve everything. That's in direct contrast to both NAFTA and Settembrini, who are so methodical, who are always debating, always going through their logics. Meanwhile, you have Krakowski, who is a parody in many ways of Sigmund Freud. The psychoanalyst of the Berghof elevates the immaterial over the material, seeing physical illness as the manifestation of repressions and illness within the subconscious. Lastly, you have director Behrens, the director of the Berghof, who, beneath its cheery exterior, seems remarkably indifferent to whether his patients actually recover. He manages the patient's decline in many ways, seeing suffering as a simple, merely chemical process, but not necessarily something to be solved, at least not quickly. So what is the point of all of these characters who each epitomize their respective philosophies that were dominant in the Europe of this time? It's really to say that when any one of these systems of thought is carried to its extreme, it ends in the same place: contradiction and truly a sort of nihilism. NAFTA is probably the most obvious case of that. If the flesh is transient and the spirit is immortal, and man ought to be essentially of the spirit, how is the flesh to be ultimately overcome? Through dissolution and death. In that sense, death is a good thing. It frees humanity inasmuch as it's corruptible. This philosophy is explicitly anti-life. And an immediate contradiction arises in how the individual dictators entrusted with administering the absolute can be trusted to not twist it to their individual advantage. Settembrini, meanwhile, he represses the dark, mystical, spiritual parts of humanity. And no matter how likable he is in many ways, you can't get around that. He sees them as something to be conquered and all suffering solvable via human reason. Yet these parts of humanity are not completely conquerable. The dark elements of the human psyche, death itself, some of these psychological problems, I mean, he himself is evidence in that he suffers from a terminal illness that can't be solved. Further, if humanity is good in as much as it's reasonable, and the ideal is to create a society most in line with reason, yet humans are so inextricably linked to irrationality, then leading to that perfect reason may require great violence to strip away all of those irrational elements. It quickly becomes clear that this is also an unbalanced philosophy that can lead to a host of problems. Then you have Pieperkorn, the ultimate Dionysian, the hedonist. Well, if life is only meaningful as long as the individual can remain vital, what is the individual to do in sickness? As Pieperkorn is forced to seek greater and greater pleasures to attain to an elevated emotional state, he eventually self-destructs, and that's really inevitable. Claudia, then, being passive and opposed to bourgeois taste, eventually falls under the spell of Pieperkorn, symbolizing that in the absence of reason, the most dominant characters that exercise the highest passions prevail, even if those characters are essentially self-destructive and lead everyone around them to ruin. In that sense, there still is a room for reason within humanity, and it's not something to be wholly dismissed. Lastly, Krakowski absurdly moves from a respected scientific psychoanalyst to performing seances by the end of the book, making the point that psychoanalysis is in many ways its own religion, obsessed in unseen forces, elevating the subconscious, and kind of leading to the occult. So some key musings about all of this. Going back to this idea of Pieperkorn's physical dominance, Settembrini and NAFTA's arguments feel quite insignificant and abstract in the face of that. The book often makes the point that philosophies don't emerge in a vacuum. Trace NAFTA's development, for example. His father was murdered when he was a younger man. Further, his father was a kosher butcher, meaning that his job was linked to a sanctification of death through slaughtering animals. And also, NAFTA has always been sickly and is on death's door. So, having that sort of philosophy that says death and dissolution are superior, the spirit is greater than the flesh, can make him feel superior in a sense, being so close to death. In essence, the grand abstractions of humanity emerge from and find resonance due to psychological impulses, and in a sense, maybe secondary to psychology. Even with Settembrini, the humanist, he agrees to duel NAFTA at the end of the book, to partake in violence, because beneath everything, he asserts it's a matter of honor. Hans is befuddled by this. How, he asks. NAFTA didn't insult you personally. He didn't insult your woman. It's not a matter of honor. Settembrini says, no, he did insult me because he insulted my ideas, which in a sense are me. Once an ideology has become so bound up with who someone is, an insult against it is not merely an insult against the abstraction, but the individual, and death and violence inevitably result. But going back to Hans, he's most notable in his radical openness in this book. The reason he can't understand Settembrini and NAFTA is that fixed ideas are so essentially not who he is. What Hans is curiosity and a willingness to entertain everything, a total lack of rigidity, all the ideas, in a sense. And while he's often described as mediocre, he does come to the greatest philosophical insight in the book during his vision in the snow. In that pivotal chapter, Hans, who's out skiing in a snowstorm, hallucinates a beautiful sea with happy people who love life. A boy on the shore then solemnly looks up to a temple that inside has an ongoing ritual of human sacrifice. Hans realizes this imagined utopia's goodness is not in the people pretending, as Settembrini would, that the temple isn't there, nor, as NAFTA would, spending all their time in the temple, but the goodness is in loving the beauty of life and physical reality, while frankly accepting the power of death, irrationality, and the mystic. Hans's revelation is relatively simple and summed up in a very memorable sentence. For the sake of goodness and love, man shall let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts, which really refutes both Settembrini and NAFTA. With NAFTA, it's obvious. It removes the sovereign status of death that he would advocate. But it also, from the perspective of Settembrini, is not being done for the sake of reason. No, it's for the sake of goodness and love that death shall have no sovereignty. This love, in my mind, is less about loving humanity inasmuch as it attains to an ideal, or inasmuch as it's been perfected. As we discussed, those concepts of perfection often spring from individual psychological pathologies anyway. And it's more about taking humans as they are, dignified precisely as a result of their tension between physical limitations and spiritual aspirations. They're essentially incomplete, and that's part of what's beautiful. Not that they should be completed. Now, of course, the ending should be discussed. Notably, Hans forgets about his revelation in the snow almost immediately after it happens, falling back into his listlessness at the Berghof. NAFTA then eventually shoots himself in his duel with Settembrini after Settembrini fires in the air as an act of humanist charity and mercy, which can in many ways be seen as NAFTA refusing to concede the argument. Had he walked away, then Settembrini retains a moral high ground. Had he shot Settembrini, then he's a villain. So he does all he can to ensure that Settembrini can live with guilt for the rest of his life, which is very dark and quite depressing. Further, Joachim had gone down to do his duty in the flatlands and is ultimately sent back up and dies on the mountain without seeing battle due to his illness. When he was the military man, that was what his dream was. Well, Hans gets to live it out while Hans describes himself as the perpetual civilian. He is ignited by the thunderbolt of the oncoming war and has to go down and fight. And eventually Hans, in leaving the mountain, goes from an individual who spends hours musing about the nature of the self and abstract philosophy to just another faceless member of a collective, simply trying to survive on the battlefield. So there's an obviously cynical way that this book can be read. Number one, great ideas arise from pathologies, and both give way to and reinforce primal notions like honor, dominance, and feeling. And in that sense, what humans create is quite insignificant. What history is really being shaped by are these more immutable, base, animalistic forces. All else is pretension. Two, in Europe, in the lead up to World War One, there wasn't really enlightenment, but people were bored and sick in much the same way as the Berghoff, and the immediate reality of the war was far realer than any philosophy thought up in peace. And third, Castor probably dies in the war. And for what? And for what did he become enlightened? Or did he even become enlightened? Yet another way the book can be seen is sure. Maybe Schubert's idealistic music is less something that comes from discovered, objectively meaningful, ideal reality, and more something that came from a subjective interpretation of reality colored by his unique pathologies. But nevertheless, that music still feels transcendent. And as Hans Castorp sings it on the battlefield in the last scene, it does lend beauty to an otherwise horrific moment. So if all great art and grand narratives are in a sense reducible to subjectivity, the question then becomes, so what? The song is still beautiful, and it taps into something that feels beyond us, regardless of the provability of that sense we feel or the origin of the song. What I think the Magic Mountain most conclusively advises against is rigidity. When humanity becomes a clearly systematized, ideal abstraction, any deviations from that ideal should be annihilated. And that's just collateral in bringing about a utopia. When we fail to listen, letting our views become synonymous with us and taking any slight against our ideology as a personal challenge, violence inevitably results. And so the answer may be less than an abandoning all notions of beauty, greatness, and meaning, but instead exercising humility while loving people as they are and maintaining an open mind. I think in this sense, this book and its message may be just as relevant as ever in 21st century America. And so I give it a 10 out of 10. I was really impressed by it, and while it is very lengthy, and so lengthy, in fact, I couldn't even go in depth on its treatment of the subjective nature of the passage of time and the tension with that is also an objective dimension, as well as some details about Hans's relationship with Kloftia and whatnot. But I hope that this review served to be sort of a good 18-minute little, honestly, a little shallow read of the book in terms of just how deep it is. And I think that's a testament to Thomas Mann and a testament to how well done this was. I'd highly recommend it to anybody who has a kind of time to read that many pages.